They said the medic wouldn't last an hour outside the wire. Too small, too quiet, too soft for the kind of war that chewed up hardened operators and spat them out in pieces. But when the ambush ripped through that Afghan riverbed, when even the SEALs started dropping their weapons, she didn't. She ran forward, dragging men twice her size, bleeding herself, but refusing to let them die. Before I show you exactly what happened in that valley, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The forward operating base sat in the Afghan dust like a scab that wouldn't heal. Everything here was temporary. Prefab walls, sandbags that had been moved and moved again, guard towers that leaned at angles that suggested they'd given up trying to look permanent. The air tasted of diesel exhaust and resignation, thick with the kind of heat that made metal too hot to touch and turned sweat into salt crystals before it could fall. Sergeant Tessa Moran climbed down from the supply truck with her aid bag cutting into her shoulder and dust already settling in her hair. Mid-30s, lean in the way people got when they'd learned to make do with less, wearing a uniform that had seen enough field time to know what it was for. Her gear was squared away, every strap tight, every pouch positioned exactly where muscle memory could find it in the dark. The SEALs lounging near the armory gave her the kind of look reserved for things that didn't quite belong. 6 men with sunburned faces and weapons that hung from their bodies like extensions of bone and sinew. They'd been here long enough for the dust to work its way into the creases around their eyes, long enough to know what this valley could do to people who weren't ready for it. Petty Officer Kowalski, broad across the shoulders with arms that suggested he'd been lifting more than weights, let out a chuckle that carried just far enough. "Outstanding! They sent us a medic!" He spat into the dirt. "What are we supposed to do? Ask the Taliban to form an orderly line for Band-Aids?" Petty Officer Danner shook his head, grinning at his own joke before he made it. "Doc, no offense, but this isn't sick call. We move fast, we move hard, and we don't stop for people who can't keep up." The laughter rippled through the group, not mean exactly, but sharp enough to draw lines in the sand. She was outside their circle, and they wanted her to know it. Tessa didn't argue. She dropped her ruck, unzipped her aid bag, and began checking her kit with the kind of methodical precision that spoke of ritual. Combat gauze counted and recounted, tourniquets tested for tension, chest seals checked for tears in the packaging. Her fingers moved automatically, muscle memory from too many pre-mission inspections, where the difference between thorough and close enough was measured in heartbeats. Santos, younger than the others and still trying to prove he belonged, leaned on his rifle. "You really think all that's going to help when we're taking contact?" Tessa glanced up once, briefly, her eyes taking in details the others missed. The sweat stains on Santos's uniform that said he wasn't drinking enough water, the way Kowalski kept shifting his weight off his left foot. The frayed radio antenna on team leader Morris's vest that suggested comm problems they hadn't mentioned in briefing. "When you're choking on your own blood," she said quietly, "it'll help plenty." The grin faded from Santos's face. The easy laughter died. She went back to her kit, fingers moving through supplies with the same calm efficiency. No bravado, no challenges thrown back. Just a professional doing her job while others decided whether that job mattered. "Hey, Doc," Kowalski called out, louder this time. "Since you're so concerned about our welfare, maybe you can explain why they sent us dead weight instead of another gun?" Before she could answer, Santos yelped and jerked his hand back from his rifle. Blood welled from his palm where he'd caught it on a sharp edge of his weapon's rail system. "Damn it," he muttered, shaking his hand. "Walk it off," Danner laughed. "It's just a scratch." But Tessa was already moving. She crossed the space between them in 3 quick steps, her aid bag already open. "Let me see." Santos tried to wave her off. "It's nothing really, just a little... It's a puncture wound that goes to bone," she said, taking his wrist with gentle firmness. "In this environment, that's sepsis waiting to happen." Her voice was matter of fact. No, I told you so in it. She cleaned the wound with practiced efficiency, applied antibiotic ointment, and wrapped it with medical tape. Keep it dry for 24 hours. The laughter had died. Santos flexed his fingers, surprised at how much better it felt. Thanks, Doc. Kowalski scoffed, but it sounded forced now, still just a scratch. Yeah, Tessa said, packing her supplies back into her kit. Until it isn't. But Chief Petty Officer Morris, standing apart from his men with the weight of command written in the set of his shoulders, noticed something the others didn't. The way her hands never hesitated as she packed her kit. The way she'd assessed his team in that single glance, seeing things they hadn't told her, cataloging problems they hadn't admitted to themselves. The way she'd handled Santos's injury without making him feel foolish, even though the kid had been mocking her 30 seconds earlier. He'd been in this business long enough to know the difference between someone playing at being ready and someone who actually was. The medic they'd been assigned wasn't putting on a show. She was preparing for war. The patrol stepped off at dawn, when the heat still hugged the ground and shadows stretched long across the valley floor. 12 men moving in staggered column, rifles up, eyes scanning terrain that had killed better men than them. The mission was simple on paper: investigate reports of a weapons cache in the area locals called the Broken Teeth, where the ridgeline jutted against the sky like a predator's jaw. Simple missions had a way of becoming complicated in this part of Afghanistan. The ground beneath their boots was unforgiving, loose stone that shifted with every step, scattered with the kind of debris that spoke of previous battles. Spent brass casings glinted in the early light, and darker stains on the rock suggested not everyone who'd fought here had walked away. Tessa kept position in the middle of the column, her aid bag a familiar weight against her back. She didn't complain about the pace, didn't ask for water breaks. Her eyes moved constantly, not just watching for threats, but cataloging the small details that could matter later. The way Kowalski favored his left leg on uneven ground, the shallow breathing that said Santos was pushing too hard too early, the tension in Morris's shoulders that meant he was seeing something on the ridgelines he didn't like. Doc. Maris's voice cut through the morning air without turning around. You fall behind. You stay behind. We don't slow down for anyone. Copy that, she replied, voice steady. The SEALs pushed deeper into the valley, their movements professional, but wary. Radio checks came back full of static, either the terrain or someone jamming their frequencies. Either way, it meant they were on their own. By mid-morning, the sun had turned the valley into an oven. Heat radiated from the stones in visible waves, and sweat ran freely beneath their gear. Tessa watched Kowalski drain his canteen too fast and saw the telltale flush in his face that said he was fighting dehydration. Might want to pace that water, she said quietly, pulling an electrolyte packet from her vest. We've got hours left in this heat. Kowalski turned with irritation already written across his face. Don't worry about me, Doc. Worry about keeping up. Danner chimed in from a few meters ahead. Yeah, save the bedside manner for the aid station. More chuckles from the team. Morris didn't intervene. He was focused on his map, trying to raise command on a radio that gave him nothing but white noise in return. Tessa said nothing else. She mixed her electrolyte powder with water from her own canteen and drank it slowly, methodically, while her eyes continued their constant sweep of the terrain around them. 20 minutes later, Kowalski stumbled. It was barely noticeable, a slight weave in his step, a hand that reached out to steady himself against a rock. But Tessa saw it. Chief, she called quietly to Maris, we need to take 5. Maris turned, irritation flashing across his face. We're not even 2 clicks out. Kowalski's showing early heat casualty symptoms, muscle fatigue, mild disorientation. Push him much further without intervention, and you'll be carrying him. I'm fine, Kowalski protested, but his voice was slightly slurred. Tessa ignored him, addressing Maris directly. 5 minutes, get some electrolytes in him and check his core temperature, or lose him for the rest of the mission. The team leader studied Kowalski more closely, noting the flush in his face, the way he was breathing through his mouth. After a moment, he nodded grimly. 5 minutes. Hydrate and check gear. As Kowalski sat in the shade of a boulder, sipping the electrolyte solution Tessa prepared for him, his color gradually returned to normal. The slight tremor in his hands faded. "Feel better?" she asked. He nodded reluctantly. "Yeah, thanks." Danner shook his head in amazement. "How did you spot that?" "He looked fine to me." "Training," Tessa said simply, "and experience." When they resumed the patrol 15 minutes later, Kowalski's step was steady and sure, but more importantly, the attitude of the team had shifted slightly. They still didn't trust her completely, but they'd seen her catch something they'd missed, something that could have compromised the mission. The valley was narrowing as they moved deeper, ridgelines rising on both sides like the walls of a funnel. It was textbook ambush terrain, limited escape routes, natural cover for attackers, clear fields of fire down onto anyone stupid enough to walk the low ground. Santos muttered under his breath, "Something doesn't feel right." "Nothing feels right out here," Maris replied, but his hand tightened on his rifle. They reached the dry riverbed just after noon when the sun had turned the air into something you could almost see. The riverbed itself was a scar across the valley floor, 20 meters of gravel and broken stone where flash floods had carved out a natural highway for anyone brave enough or foolish enough to use it. Morris raised his fist and the column halted. He scanned the ridgelines through his optics, searching for the glint of metal or the shadow that didn't belong. The valley seemed empty, too empty. That's when the world exploded. The first shot cracked across the rocks like a whip, kicking up dust inches from Santos's boots. Before anyone could shout a warning, the second report boomed across the valley, an RPG shrieking in from the eastern ridge. It slammed into the far bank with a sound like the world splitting open, showering them with gravel and fire. "Contact!" Maris roared, diving for whatever cover he could find. The ambush erupted from 3 directions at once. Automatic weapons fire raked the riverbed from positions the SEALs couldn't even see, muzzle flashes winking from shadows in the rocks. Bullets snapped overhead and sparked off stone, filling the air with the whine of ricochets and the crack of near misses. The SEALs scattered, professional training taking over. They found whatever cover they could, boulders, depressions in the ground, anything that might stop a bullet, and began firing back in controlled bursts. But they were caught in the open, silhouetted against light-colored rock, while their enemy fired from concealed positions that had been chosen with care. Tessa hit the ground hard behind a chunk of broken concrete that had probably been the part of a bridge once. Her aid bag slammed into her ribs, driving the breath from her lungs. She pressed herself flat against the stone while bullets chewed the air above her head, close enough to feel the heat. That's when she heard the screams. Kowalski spun backward like he'd been hit by a baseball bat, his leg erupting in a spray of blood and torn fabric. He went down hard, clutching at his thigh while dark stains spread across the gravel beneath him. A second shot found Danner, punching through his vest and spinning him against the rocks. He slid down the stone face, leaving a red smear, his breathing harsh and wet in a way that said the bullet had found something vital. Santos took shrapnel from another RPG, the blast picking him up and slamming him down like a discarded toy. He rolled onto his side, one arm hanging useless, blood running between his fingers as he pressed them against a wound that was larger than his hand. Tessa's mind shifted into a different gear entirely. The chaos around her, the gunfire, the explosions, the shouts of the remaining SEALs faded into background noise. Her vision narrowed, focused, cataloging details with surgical precision. Kowalski, arterial bleeding, femoral artery compromised, blood loss rapid, tourniquet required immediately or unconsciousness in 90 seconds, death in 4 to 6 minutes. Danner, sucking chest wound, possible pneumothorax, labored breathing indicating lung collapse, chest seal needed within 2 minutes to prevent respiratory failure. Santos, severe laceration to upper arm and shoulder, possible radial artery involvement, signs of shock setting in. Pressure dressing and IV fluids required, but not immediately life-threatening if bleeding controlled. 3 men, 3 different medical emergencies, all critical, all requiring immediate intervention. The textbook said to triage, save who you could, accept losses where necessary, choose the most salvageable, and let the others go. Tessa had never been good at following textbooks. Multiple casualties, Maris shouted into his radio, but got only static in return. He tried again, voice tight with frustration. Command, this is Alpha. We are taking effective fire and have wounded. Nothing. They were alone. Tessa looked at the three men bleeding out on the gravel, then at the SEALs still in the fight, pressed flat behind inadequate cover, while enemy fire poured down from the heights. The math was simple and brutal. If they stayed, everyone died. If they ran, the wounded died for certain. Unless someone refused to accept either option, she made her choice. While gunfire cracked overhead and the others hugged the ground, she left her cover, crawling on her belly across open ground with bullets snapping inches above her head, dragging her aid bag behind her like an anchor. The gravel tore at her uniform and scraped skin from her elbows, but she kept moving toward the sounds of pain and the smell of blood. Doc, stay down, Maris bellowed, but she was already gone. Another RPG screamed in, detonating close enough to shower her with rock chips and heat. She covered her head with both arms, felt fragments sting her back through her uniform, then kept crawling. 30 meters felt like 30 miles, when every inch was measured against the possibility of dying, before she reached the next wounded man. She made it to Kowalski first. His face was gray with shock and blood loss, eyes wide with the kind of fear that came from feeling your life leak out onto the ground. The wound was high on his thigh, arterial bleeding that meant minutes, not hours. Tessa didn't hesitate. She ripped a tourniquet from her kit and cinched it tight above the wound, twisting the windlass until Kowalski screamed and the bleeding stopped. No time for comfort, no time for bedside manner. There were two other men dying, and a clock that wouldn't stop counting. She low-crawled to Danner, bullets tracking her movement, striking sparks from the stones around her. He was conscious, but fading, air bubbling through a hole in his chest with each breath. Sucking chest wound. She'd seen them before, treated them before. Her hands moved automatically, tearing open a chest seal and slapping it over the wound. Danner's eyes locked onto hers, desperate and afraid. Stay with me, she told him, voice calm despite the chaos around them. You're going to be fine, but I need you to stay awake. Santos was 20 meters away, dragged behind a boulder by the blast, one arm mangled and blood soaking the ground beneath him. She reached him as another burst of gunfire chewed chunks from the rock above their heads. Thought you wouldn't last, Santos whispered, his lips already pale with blood loss. Tessa packed his wound with gauze, wrapping it tight enough to stop the bleeding, but not so tight as to cut off circulation entirely. Neither did I, she replied. Guess we were both wrong. Around them, the remaining SEALs kept firing, but their movements had changed. Where before they'd been focused purely on the fight, now they kept glancing back at the medic who was doing something they'd never seen before, refusing to accept that some men were beyond saving. The enemy fire intensified as they spotted movement in the riverbed. Shouts echoed from the ridgelines, harsh voices coordinating an assault designed to finish what the ambush had started. Time was running out, but the three SEALs who should have been dead weren't dead anymore. They were stabilized, patched, given minutes they shouldn't have had, and the medic who had crawled through hell to reach them wasn't done yet. She looked at the men around her, too badly wounded to move on their own, too heavy to carry all at once. The textbook said to triage, to save who you could and accept losses. Tessa Moran had never been good at following textbooks. She hooked her arms under Kowalski's shoulders and began to drag him toward the far end of the riverbed, where a depression in the ground offered slightly better cover. He outweighed her by 60 pounds, easy, and his gear added another 30. Every step was a battle against his weight and her own exhaustion. Bullets tracked her movement, kicking up sprays of gravel that stung her legs and arms. She ignored them, focused only on the next step, the next breath, the next few inches of ground covered. What the hell are you doing? Maris shouted, firing a burst to keep enemy heads down. Getting them out, she replied, voice steady despite the strain. She made it 30 meters before her legs gave out. Kowalski's weight folded her to the ground, but she didn't let go. She adjusted her grip and started dragging him again, inch by grinding inch, while machine gun fire chewed up the rocks around them. When she reached the depression, she rolled Kowalski into it and immediately started back for Santos. No rest, no pause to catch her breath. Two more men to move, and the enemy was closing in. Santos tried to protest when she grabbed his vest. "Leave me," he whispered. "Can't make it anyway." "Shut up," she told him, not unkindly. "Nobody gets left behind." The drag back to the depression was longer this time. Her arms screamed, her back felt like it was tearing apart, and sweat ran into her eyes until she could barely see, but she kept moving, one step at a time. While the SEALs still in the fight laid down covering fire that kept the enemy honest, Danner was the hardest. The chest wound made him delicate. Too much jostling could start internal bleeding that would kill him faster than a bullet. She had to balance speed against care, moving him as quickly as she could while trying not to do more damage. Halfway to the depression, a grenade landed close enough to lift her off her feet. The blast slammed her into the ground with Danner's weight on top of her, driving the breath from her lungs and filling her vision with stars. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but lie in the dirt and wonder if this was how it ended. Then Danner coughed blood onto her uniform, and her training kicked back in. She rolled him off, checked his vitals, and started dragging again. When all three wounded men were in the depression, she collapsed against the dirt wall and allowed herself exactly 10 seconds to shake, 10 seconds to acknowledge that she'd just done something impossible. Then she was back to checking wounds, adjusting bandages, monitoring the vitals of men who should have been dead 20 minutes ago. The radio crackled with static, then cleared. Maris's voice was tight with relief and disbelief. "Command, this is Alpha. 3 urgent surgical, 1 walking wounded. Request immediate medevac. Copy Alpha. QRF inbound. ETA 8 minutes. 8 minutes. It might as well have been 8 hours. The enemy wasn't giving up. If anything, the fire was intensifying as they realized their prey was still alive and fighting back. Voices echoed from the ridgelines, coordinating a final push to finish the job before American reinforcements could arrive. Tessa grabbed Santos's rifle from where it had fallen and checked the chamber. She wasn't infantry, wasn't trained for this kind of fighting, but the alternative was watching 3 men die because she couldn't hold a trigger for 8 more minutes. She rose above the lip of the depression and fired controlled bursts at muzzle flashes in the rocks. The recoil jarred her bruised shoulder, and she wasn't hitting much, but it was enough to make the enemy duck and think twice about their next move. "Doc," Maris called out, amazement clear in his voice despite the gunfire. "What the hell are they teaching medics these days?" "Same thing they always taught us," she replied, dropping back into cover to reload. "Keep your people alive." She fired again, then ducked as return fire chewed chunks from the rim of the depression. Behind her, Kowalski managed a weak grin. "Still think you won't last out here?" "Ask me in 8 minutes, she said. The sound came as a whisper first, then grew into the unmistakable thump of rotor blades beating the air. A Blackhawk appeared over the ridge, flying low and fast, its door guns already traversing for targets. The enemy fire shifted, trying to track the helicopter as it swept overhead. That gave the SEALs on the ground the opening they needed. They rose from cover and laid down suppressing fire while the bird circled back for landing. Dust clouds exploded as the helicopter touched down, rotors still turning, crew chiefs already moving to help with the wounded. Tessa didn't wait for permission. She grabbed Kowalski under the arms and began dragging him toward the bird, her legs shaking with exhaustion, but her grip never loosening. The crew chief met her halfway, shouting over the rotor noise. "How bad?" "Arterial bleeding controlled with tourniquet. Chest wound sealed but needs surgical intervention immediately. Third has severe lacerations and possible internal injuries." Her report was clinical, professional, delivered while she helped load Kowalski onto a stretcher. She went back for Santos, then Danner, refusing help from the crew even though her arms felt like rubber, and her vision was starting to tunnel. These were her patients. She'd brought them this far. Only when all 3 wounded SEALs were loaded did she finally allow herself to collapse against the helicopter's bulkhead. The crew chief pressed a bottle of water into her hands and shouted something she couldn't hear over the engines. As the Blackhawk lifted off, banking away from the kill zone, she looked down at the 3 men on stretchers. Kowalski's color was better. The IV fluids were helping. Danner was breathing easier now that they could give him oxygen. Santos had his eyes open, tracking movement, which meant his brain was getting blood. They were going to live, all three of them. The crew chief leaned close to her ear. "What you did back there, that was something else." Tessa shook her head, too exhausted for conversation. But Maris, strapped into the seat across from her, caught her eye and held up something he'd pulled from his vest, a trident patch, worn soft with age and sweat. He pressed it into her hand and leaned close enough to be heard over the rotors. "That's yours now. You earned it." She looked down at the patch, then back up at him. For the first time since the ambush started, her professional calm cracked just slightly. Not with pride or satisfaction, but with the quiet recognition of something that couldn't be taken back. She'd crossed a line today. The line between supporting the mission and being the mission. Between patching wounds and saving lives. Between being a medic and being something more. The helicopter banked toward the base, carrying its cargo of wounded warriors and one very tired woman who had refused to accept that some fights couldn't be won. The after-action report was 3 pages of bureaucratic language that managed to describe everything that happened without capturing any of it. 3 SEALs wounded in contact with enemy forces, stabilized in field conditions, successfully evacuated by air, returned to full duty within 6 weeks. No mention of the medic who had crawled through gunfire to reach them. No mention of the impossible drag across open ground under enemy fire. No mention of the woman who had carried 3 full-grown operators to safety because she refused to consider any other option. But stories like that don't need official recognition to survive. They live in the places where warriors gather to remember the times when everything went wrong and somehow turned out right anyway. In mess halls and motor pools, around burn barrels, where the real history of wars gets told in voices too quiet for reporters to hear. A phrase started making the rounds. Quiet at first, then spreading through the community like ripples on water. Not a motto or a battle cry, but a reminder of what was possible when someone refused to quit. Drag them out alive. Said when missions looked hopeless. Said when the smart money was on cutting losses and running. Said in memory of a day when a medic had proven that sometimes the only difference between defeat and victory was one person's refusal to accept that some things couldn't be done. The 3 SEALs recovered completely. Kowalski returned to his team with a slight limp that only showed when he was tired. Danner had a scar across his chest that he claimed made him more attractive to women. Santos learned to shoot left-handed and claimed he was better than before. They never forgot the medic who had dragged them out of that riverbed. And when new personnel rotated through the base, when young operators talked big about what they could handle, the veterans would tell them about the quiet woman with the aid bag who had redefined what courage looked like. Because in the end, that's what real warriors remembered. Not the size of the explosion or the number of enemies killed, but the moment when someone who didn't have to be a hero became one anyway. And sometimes when the situation looked impossible and the smart play was to cut losses and run, they'd remember what Sergeant Tessa Moran had taught them in a riverbed in Afghanistan. That the only acceptable casualty rate for your people is 0. And that sometimes the person least likely to save the day is exactly the person who will. What would you have thought? Watching a medic carry 3 wounded SEALs across a battlefield while bullets flew overhead. Would you have had the courage to crawl into that kill zone when everyone else was pinned down? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story reminded you that heroes don't always carry the biggest gun, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell so you never miss what happens next. Share this with someone who knows that the quiet professionals are usually the most dangerous ones in the room. More stories about warriors who refuse to quit are waiting on your screen right now. Click 1 to keep watching, and I'll see you tomorrow with another reminder that courage comes in all sizes. Until then, remember, sometimes the person who saves everyone is the one nobody expected to last 5 minutes.